The screech of tires against wet asphalt should have been her first warning. Sophia Mendez clutched the rejection letter from the city council, her knuckles white as she walked down Oakwood Avenue. 3 months of late nights writing grant proposals. 3 months of hope that maybe this time would be different. Now, the children at the community center deserved better than her constant failures to secure funding. She barely registered the roar of the engine until it was too late. The midnight blue Aston Martin cut through traffic like a predator, its driver gesticulating wildly into a Bluetooth headset. Water from the morning's rain pooled in the gutter, waiting. As the luxury car swerved around a delivery truck, it hit the puddle at precisely the wrong angle. The wave of dirty street water crashed over Sophia like a cold slap of reality. Her white blouse, the only professional one she owned, was instantly soaked through. Her leather messenger bag, already worn from years of use, dripped steadily onto the sidewalk. The Aston Martin came to a stop at the red light just ahead. Through the open window, she could see him. Designer sunglasses, Italian leather gloves, not a care in the world. He was laughing at something someone had said through his earpiece, completely oblivious to the destruction he'd left in his wake. Something inside Sophia snapped. Maybe it was the third funding rejection this year. Maybe it was the memory of telling 8-year-old Marcus that they might not have art supplies next month. Maybe it was the sight of this man in his car that cost more than her annual salary, treating the world like his personal playground. Her fingers found the small rock on the sidewalk before her rational mind could intervene. "Hey!" she shouted, marching toward the car. Alexander Sterling was in the middle of closing a 7-figure acquisition when the commotion started. The woman approaching his car looked like she'd been through a hurricane. Her dark curls plastered to her face, her clothes dripping wet. "Listen, Richards, I'll call you back," he said into his earpiece, already reaching for the door handle. "Some lunatic is about to damage my property." The sound of stone meeting metal was like a gunshot in the quiet morning air. Alexander watched in horrified slow motion as a quarter-sized dent appeared on his pristine car door. The woman stood there, chest heaving, looking like an avenging angel who'd lost a fight with a fire hydrant. "Are you completely insane?" bellowed, stepping out of the car. Traffic laws and common sense abandoned him as he slammed the door. "Do you have any idea what this car costs? Do you have any idea what this blouse cost?" Sophia shot back, gesturing to her soaked clothes. "Not that you'd care about anyone but yourself. You threw a rock at my car." Alexander's voice rose to a pitch he hadn't used since boarding school. His perfectly styled hair fell across his forehead as he gestured wildly. "That's vandalism, that's a crime." "So is assault," Sophia countered, wringing water from her sleeve. "Being a complete narcissist should be one too." Crowd was gathering. Smartphones appeared like magic, already recording what would undoubtedly become the neighborhood's entertainment for the week. Alexander straightened his Italian silk tie, acutely aware that his public image was about to take another hit. "Calling the police?" he said, pulling out his phone with a shaking hand. Sophia's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Go ahead. I'd love to explain to them how the famous Alexander Sterling drives like he owns every road in the city." Alexander froze. She knew who he was. This was getting worse by the second. The last thing his company needed was another scandal involving him and social media. "Fine," he said, through gritted teeth, lowering his phone. "What do you want? Money for dry cleaning?" Sophia's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Unlike everyone else in your orbit, I can't be bought. I want an apology." "An apology?" Alexander repeated the words like she'd asked him to donate a kidney. "For what exactly? For driving like a maniac? For soaking me? For being a perfect? An example of everything wrong with people who think money makes them untouchable." The horn blast from behind them cut through their standoff. The light had turned green, and traffic was backing up behind Alexander's abandoned Aston Martin. "This isn't over," Alexander warned, stepping back toward his car. "You're absolutely right about that," Sophia called after him, already mentally composing her complaint to the traffic authority. Neither of them noticed the sleek black Bentley parked across the street, nor the elderly woman with a silver-topped cane watching the entire exchange through tinted windows with the focused attention of a chess master, planning her next move. Well, Eleanor Sterling murmured to her driver, a satisfied smile playing at her lips. I believe we've found the perfect match for my impossible grandson. She pulled out her phone and speed dialed her private investigator. Charles, I need you to find out everything about a young woman. Dark curls, about 5'6", works somewhere that involves helping children. She was just on Oakwood Avenue having a very public argument with my grandson. As the Bentley pulled away from the curb, Eleanor allowed herself a moment of genuine optimism. Alexander needed someone who wouldn't be impressed by his money or intimidated by his temper. Someone who would stand up to him, challenge him maybe, even make him remember the decent man she knew he could be. The rock had been thrown, and there was no going back. But Eleanor Sterling had been playing the long game for 8 decades, and she was just getting started. The Sterling mansion perched on Beacon Hill like a Gothic cathedral, all spires and shadows against the evening sky. Alexander stormed through the mahogany doors, still seething from the morning's humiliation. The quarter-sized dent in his Aston. Martin felt like a personal attack on everything he'd built. Mr. Sterling. Graves materialized from the shadows with the silent efficiency that had made him indispensable to 3 generations of Sterlings. Your grandmother requests your immediate presence in the East drawing room. Alexander checked his limited edition Patek Philippe. I have a conference call with Tokyo in 20 minutes. Madame Sterling mentioned something about the future. Of Sterling Enterprises, Graves replied with practiced neutrality. That got Alexander's attention. Eleanor Sterling might be 82, but she controlled 51% of the family business. When she summoned him about company matters, even Alexander knew better than to argue. The East drawing room was Eleanor's domain, unchanged since the 1960s, and filled with priceless antiques that had witnessed decades of Sterling family drama. Eleanor sat in her favorite wingback chair, ramrod straight despite her age, silver hair perfectly styled, even at the end of the day. Alexander, she said without looking up from her tablet. You're late. I'm actually early for once, grandmother. He bent to kiss her papery cheek, inhaling the familiar scent of Chanel No. 5 and old money. What's so urgent about the company? Eleanor set down her tablet and fixed him with a penetrating stare that had intimidated senators and CEOs for decades. The company is thriving. It's you I'm concerned about. Alexander stiffened. My division posted record profits last quarter, and your public behavior posted record lows. Eleanor tapped a manicured finger against her tablet. Like this morning's spectacle. With horrifying clarity, Alexander realized what his grandmother was referring to. You saw that? Eleanor turned her tablet around, revealing a social media post that made Alexander's stomach drop. Tech billionaire Alexander Sterling loses it over car scratch while soaking innocent woman. The video already had 50,000 views and climbing. That woman threw a rock at my car, Alexander protested weakly. After you drenched her clothes and nearly ran over Mrs. Pemberton, who happens to sit on the board of the Westfield Foundation. Eleanor's voice carried the weight of disappointment that cut deeper than anger. Alexander pinched the bridge of his nose. The Westfield Foundation was Sterling Enterprises' largest charitable partner. I'll have PR handle the damage control. You can't public relations your way out of who you've become, Alexander. Eleanor's voice softened slightly. Your grandfather and I didn't build this empire so our grandson could turn into another entitled rich man who treats people like obstacles. I've tripled the tech division's value in 5 years, Alexander defended himself. And lost yourself. In the process, Eleanor sighed deeply. You know the conditions of your grandfather's will. In 3 months, on your 33rd birthday, you'll either assume control of the company as a married man, or your cousin Richard takes the position. Alexander scoffed. That archaic clause isn't legally enforceable. This is the 21st century, not the Victorian era. It is when I control the board, Eleanor said simply. Your grandfather believed a man needed a partner to ground him before he could lead effectively. Given your recent behavior, I'm inclined to agree. So what do you expect me to do? Find a wife in 3 months. Order one online, like everything. Else Eleanor's lips curved into a smile that made Alexander instantly wary. As a matter of fact, I've already found one for you. Across town, Sophia was trying to salvage what remained of her dignity and her day. After changing into the spare clothes she kept at the community center, She threw herself into work, determined not to let Alexander Sterling ruin her mood any further. Ms. Mendez, Thomas, the 16-year-old volunteer who manned the front desk after school, poked his head into her cramped office. "There's someone here to see you." Sophia looked up from the grant application she was rewriting. "I don't have any appointments this afternoon. She says it's important. Something about funding." Thomas whispered the last word like it was sacred. Funding was exactly what they needed. Send her in. Nothing could have prepared Sophia for the elegant elderly woman who entered her office, moving with surprising grace despite the ornate cane that probably cost more than Sophia's monthly rent. "Ms. Mendez," the woman extended a perfectly manicured hand. "Eleanor Sterling. I believe you've already met my grandson." Sophia's blood turned to ice water. "Sterling, as in Alexander Sterling." "The very same," Eleanor confirmed, settling into the folding chair across from Sophia's desk without waiting for an invitation. "I witnessed your encounter with him this morning." Sophia's professional composure crumbled. "Mrs. Sterling, I can explain about the rock. Your grandson was driving recklessly, and when he soaked my clothes, Eleanor waved away her concern with an amused smile. "Please, dear. If more people stood up to him, perhaps he wouldn't be such a terror." "And it's Madame Sterling?" Thoroughly confused, Sophia nodded slowly. "Madame Sterling, what can I do for you?" "It's what I can do for you, Miss Mendez." Eleanor placed a leather portfolio on Sophia's cluttered desk. "Inside, you'll find details of a grant for $5 million to your community center, renewable annually for the next decade." Sophia's jaw dropped. She'd been fighting for scraps of funding for years, writing endless applications for grants that rarely exceeded $10,000. Now this woman was casually offering her more money than she'd ever imagined. "That's incredibly generous, but I don't understand why there is, of course, a condition," Eleanor continued, her eyes twinkling with something that made Sophia's survival instincts scream warnings. "What kind of condition?" Sophia asked cautiously. Eleanor's smile widened. "You'll marry my grandson within the month?" Sophia stared at the elderly woman, waiting for the punchline. When none came, she burst into nervous laughter. "That's hilarious. Did my friend Javier put you up to this? It's not even April Fool's Day." Eleanor didn't crack a smile, I assure. "You, Ms. Mendez, this is no joke. My grandson needs to be married before his 33rd birthday to assume control of our company. You need funding for your admirable community programs. I'm proposing a mutually beneficial arrangement." The laughter died in Sophia's throat. "You're serious, perfectly serious. But why me? Your grandson and I despise each other. We literally just met this morning when I threw a rock at his car." "Precisely," Eleanor said with satisfaction. "You're the first woman I've seen stand up to him in years. Everyone else either fears his money or wants it. You, Miss Mendez, did neither." Sophia stood up, pacing her small office like a caged animal. "This is insane. People don't arrange marriages anymore, especially between complete strangers who can't stand each other." "It would only be for 1 year," Eleanor continued, as if Sophia hadn't spoken. "After that, you can quietly divorce. We'll keep the grant funding regardless, and Alexander will maintain control of the company." Sophia stopped pacing. 1 year of my life married to the most arrogant man I've ever met. In exchange for securing your community center's future for a decade, Eleanor said softly. "Think of all the children you could help. The programs. You could fund the difference you could make." Sophia's mind raced. This was madness, complete and utter madness. Yet the rational part of her brain couldn't help calculating how many lives could be changed with that kind of money. The after-school programs could expand. They could hire actual teachers instead of relying on volunteers. They could renovate the crumbling building that leaked every time it rained. "Does your grandson know about this ridiculous plan?" Sophia finally asked. Eleanor's smile widened into something almost predatory. "He's being informed as we speak." "You want me to what?" Alexander's voice cracked like a teenager's. "Lower your voice, Alexander. I raised you with better manners than that." Eleanor stood with surprising agility for her age, moving toward the door with the satisfied air of someone who just played a winning chess move. "You expect me to marry the psychotic woman who vandalized my car this morning?" Alexander ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, destroying hours of his stylist's work. Have you completely lost your mind? On the contrary, I've found the perfect solution to our predicament. Eleanor paused at the doorway. Sophia Mendez runs a community center that serves underprivileged youth. Exactly the kind of public relations connections Sterling Enterprises needs after your recent escapades. So hire her as a consultant. Don't marry me off to her like some medieval princess. The board meeting is tomorrow morning. I expect you to announce your engagement. Eleanor's voice carried the finality of a judge's sentence. She'll be joining us for dinner tonight. 8 o'clock sharp. Don't be late.
Alexander stood,
Frozen in the center of the room as his grandmother departed, leaving him alone with the magnitude of what she was proposing. Marriage to a complete stranger. A stranger who hated him and had already proven she wasn't afraid to fight back. Sir? Graves appeared in the doorway with supernatural timing. Shall I lay out your dinner jacket for this evening? Alexander grabbed the nearest object, a priceless Ming Dynasty vase, and for one wild moment considered hurling it across the room. Then he remembered the last time he'd damaged a family heirloom, and the month he'd spent cut off from his trust fund. He carefully set the vase down. Yes, Graves. And make it a double whiskey. Actually, make it a triple. Meanwhile, Eleanor's chauffeur navigated the evening traffic back to the mansion. In the back seat, Eleanor allowed herself a satisfied smile. Phase 1 of her plan was complete. Sophia hadn't said yes, but she hadn't said no either. And Alexander, for all his bluster, would never risk losing the company to his mediocre cousin Richard. James, Eleanor said suddenly to her chauffeur, does Chef Bernard know we'll have a guest for dinner? Yes, madame. And the blue guest suite has been prepared as you requested. Eleanor nodded approvingly. Excellent. I have a feeling, Ms. Mendez might need to stay overnight after she and Alexander discussed terms. In her tiny apartment across town, Sophia stared at the business card Eleanor had left behind. On the back, the elegant woman had written an address and dinner, 8 p.m., in flowing script. This is completely insane, she told Frida, her tabby cat, who was the only witness to her current mental breakdown. Absolutely certifiable. Frida meowed. In what seemed like agreement, but her judgmental stare suggested she thought Sophia was protesting too much. Despite her better judgment, Sophia found herself opening her closet and pushing aside her practical work clothes to find the one cocktail dress she owned. The deep emerald green number had been an impulse purchase for her college. Roommate's wedding 3 years ago, and had hung unworn ever since. I'm just going to tell them no in person, she justified to the cat while stepping into the dress. It's the polite thing to do. Frida's expression suggested she didn't believe that for a second. Sophia's Uber pulled up to the Sterling Mansion gates at exactly 7:30. She sat frozen in the back seat, suddenly questioning every life decision that had led her to this moment. This is it, right? Driver asked, eyeing the imposing iron gates with visible intimidation. Apparently, Sophia muttered, clutching her worn leather purse like a shield. The gates swung open automatically, and the Uber crept up the winding driveway. Sophia's stomach twisted into increasingly complex knots as the mansion came into view. The sprawling architectural masterpiece made her feel even more out of place in her 3-year-old dress and department store heels. Good luck in there, the driver said as she stepped out. Looks like the kind of place that eats people like us for breakfast. Thanks for the pep talk, Sophia replied dryly, but tipped him generously anyway. She'd barely reached the massive front door when it swung open, revealing Graves with his perpetual expression of polite neutrality. It's Ms. Mendez. Welcome to Sterling Manor, he said with a slight bow. Madame Sterling is expecting you in the main parlor. Sophia followed him through a foyer larger than her entire apartment, past priceless artwork and antiques that probably cost more than her annual salary. Each step on the marble floor echoed like a countdown to disaster. Ms. Sophia Mendez, Graves announced as they entered a lavishly decorated room where Eleanor sat regally on a velvet settee. Ah, Sophia, right on time, Eleanor said warmly, extending her hand. Punctuality is another excellent quality Alexander could learn from you. Where is Mr. Sterling? Sophia asked, glancing around nervously.
Yes.
Making an entrance, no doubt, Eleanor said with a hint of maternal disapproval. Whiskey Graves. For our guest? Actually, I'd prefer Sophia began.
Nonsense, dear.
You'll need it, Eleanor interrupted, patting the seat beside her. Now, before my grandson arrives, let's discuss the practical aspects of this arrangement. Sophia perched on the edge of the settee like a bird ready to take flight. Madame Sterling, I appreciate your offer, but I can't possibly $5 million. Annually, Eleanor said quietly. Renewable for 10 years. That's $50 million for your community center, Sophia. How many children could you help with that kind of funding? The number hit Sophia like a physical blow. $50 million. She could renovate the entire building, hire qualified staff, expand programs to serve the whole neighborhood. Could change lives on a scale she'd never imagined possible. But marriage, she whispered, to a complete stranger who despises me. 1 year, Eleanor repeated. And I suspect you might find my grandson more tolerable than you think once you get past his protective armor of arrogance. Before Sophia could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Alexander appeared in the doorway, and Sophia's breath caught despite herself. Gone was the disheveled, angry man from the morning. This Alexander wore a perfectly tailored dinner jacket that emphasized his broad shoulders, his dark hair styled. With casual precision, he looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine spread for expensive whiskey or luxury watches. Then he opened his mouth. So you're the woman who's supposedly going to be my wife? He said, his voice dripping with disdain. As he entered the room, I have to admit, grandmother, your taste in candidates has certainly declined. Sophia stood up, fire flashing in her dark eyes. And you're the man who's supposedly mature enough to run a company. I have to admit, the bar seems remarkably low. Eleanor clapped her hands together with delight. Excellent. You're already sparking off each other. This is going to work beautifully. Alexander poured himself a generous whiskey from the bar cart, his movements sharp with barely controlled anger. This isn't going to work at all. I refuse to marry someone I met 12 hours ago, especially someone who damaged my property. Your property? Sophia repeated incredulously. I threw a pebble at your car door. You soaked me with street water like I was invisible. It wasn't a pebble, it was a rock, and there's now a dent that will cost $3,000 to repair. $3,000? Sophia's voice rose in disbelief. For a tiny dent? That's more than some families live on for months. Exactly my point, Alexander said, taking a large gulp of whiskey. We live in completely different worlds. This ridiculous scheme of my grandmother's will never work. Eleanor watched the exchange with growing satisfaction. On the contrary, I think you're both exactly what the other needs. What I need, Alexander said firmly, is for this conversation to end. What you need, Eleanor replied with steel in her voice, is to remember that in 3 months, you'll either be married and in control of Sterling Enterprises, you'll be unemployed and watching your cousin Richard run the company you've spent years building. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Alexander's grip on his whiskey glass tightened until his knuckles turned white. Sophia looked between the two Sterlings, suddenly understanding the full scope of what she'd stumbled into. This wasn't just about money or marriage. This was about power, legacy, and a family locked in a battle of wills that had been brewing for decades. If I agreed to this insane arrangement, she said slowly, what exactly would be expected of me? Eleanor smiled triumphantly. I'm so glad you asked. The terms are quite simple, Eleanor said, producing a leather folder from beside her chair with the efficiency of a seasoned negotiator. A marriage of convenience lasting exactly 1 year. You'll live in the penthouse. Alexander owns downtown. Attend necessary social functions as his wife, and maintain the appearance of a genuine relationship in public. Alexander nearly choked on his whiskey. Live together? Absolutely not. This is already insane enough without the board needs to. Believe this is real. Eleanor cut him off smoothly. Half measures won't suffice. The Sterling family has weathered too many scandals for them to accept an obviously fake marriage. Sophia felt the walls of the elegant parlor closing in around her. What about my work? My life? I can't just abandon the community center. You wouldn't be abandoning anything, Eleanor assured her. In fact, Being married to Alexander would give you access to social circles that could benefit your cause immensely. Imagine the donations you could secure at charity galas, the connections you could make with other philanthropists. Alexander laughed bitterly. She wants me to parade her around like a trophy wife, to prove I'm domesticated enough to run the company. This is medieval, grandmother. This is practical, Eleanor countered. Your grandfather's will isn't going anywhere, and neither is the board's requirement. You have two choices. Alexander, marry Sophia, or watch Richard Sterling turn your tech division into another boring investment portfolio. The mention of his cousin hit its mark. Alexander's jaw tightened, and Sophia could see the war playing out behind his dark eyes. Researched Richard Sterling online after leaving the community center, where Alexander was innovative and ambitious. Richard was safe and unimaginative. The kind of man who would gut Alexander's projects in favor of predictable returns. About privacy? Sophia asked quietly. I'm not exactly comfortable with the idea of fake intimacy. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. The penthouse has 3 bedrooms. You'd each have your own space. What you choose to do beyond that would be entirely up to you. Something in the older woman's tone made Sophia's cheeks burn. She glanced at Alexander, who was staring into his whiskey glass like it held the answers to life's mysteries. I need time to think, Sophia said finally. Of course, dear. Not too much time. Eleanor stood with practiced grace. The board. Meeting is tomorrow at 10. If Alexander is going to announce his engagement, I'll need your answer by 8 a.m. 12 hours to decide whether to marry a stranger, Sophia muttered. This just keeps getting better. I'll have James drive you home, Eleanor offered, but Sophia shook her head. I'll call an Uber. I need the time to process this. She turned to Alexander, who hadn't spoken since his grandmother's ultimatum. For what it's worth, I didn't ask for any of this either. Alexander looked up, and for a moment, Sophia saw something vulnerable flicker across his features before the mask of arrogance slid back into place. No, I suppose you didn't. As Sophia gathered her purse and headed for the door, Eleanor's voice stopped her. Sophia, dear, one more thing. It's that young man Thomas at your community center. You mentioned you've been covering his family's rent for the past 3 months. Sophia froze. She'd asked Thomas not to tell anyone about the financial help she'd been providing since his father lost his job. Her own savings account was nearly empty, but she couldn't watch a 16-year-old kid worry about being evicted. How did you never mind? Yes, I've been helping them. What about it? Eleanor's smile was knowing. Nothing, dear. I just wanted to confirm what kind of person you are. Makes this arrangement even more perfect. During the silent Uber ride home, Sophia stared out the window at the city lights blurring past. Her phone buzzed with a text from her best friend Maya, asking about her day. How could she possibly explain that she'd gone from throwing a rock at a billionaire's car to considering marrying him, all in the span of 12 hours? Her apartment felt smaller than ever when she finally climbed the 3 flights of stairs to her door. Frida greeted her with an accusatory meow, clearly disapproving of the late dinner hour. Don't look at me like that, Sophia said, collapsing onto her second-hand couch. This is all your fault for not talking me out of throwing that rock. She pulled out her laptop and did what she always did when overwhelmed. Research. Alexander Sterling's business record was impressive, she had to admit. His tech innovations had revolutionized 3 different industries, and his company's employee satisfaction ratings were actually quite high. But his personal life was a different story. A string of relationships with socialites and models, all ending abruptly. Tabloid articles speculating about his commitment issues. Photos of him at expensive restaurants and exclusive clubs, always looking bored despite being surrounded by beautiful people. He was successful, brilliant, and apparently miserable. Eleanor Sterling's background was even more fascinating. Widowed young, she'd taken control of Sterling Enterprises when women in business were still a rarity. Under her guidance, the company had grown from a regional operation to a global empire. But every article mentioned her fierce protectiveness of her family and her reputation for manipulating situations to achieve her goals. Sophia was definitely being manipulated. The question was whether she cared enough to resist. Her phone rang, startling her from her research. The caller ID showed her mother's number. Mia, how was your day? Her mother asked in Spanish. Warmth in her voice, making Sophia's throat tight with emotion. Complicated, Mommy. Really complicated. The grant applications again? Sophia almost laughed. If only it were that simple. Something like that. Mama, if someone offered you everything you'd ever wanted, but it came with strings attached, what would you do? Her mother was quiet for a long moment. What kind of strings? The kind that change your whole life? The kind you can't undo? Sophia, you know I trust your judgment. But remember what your father always said. Sometimes the things that scare us most are the things we need most. After they hung up, Sophia sat in the darkness of her apartment, her father's words echoing in her mind. He died when she was 15. But his advice had guided her through college, through the decision to take the job at the community center, through every major choice she'd made since. Maybe this was one of those moments. She thought about Thomas, trying to balance school with worry about his family's housing situation. About 8-year-old Marcus, whose artwork covered her office walls because his grandmother couldn't afford art supplies at home. About the dozens of other kids who depended on the community center's programs for safety, education, and hope. $50 million could change all of their lives. 1 year of her life seemed like a small price to pay for that kind of impact. At 7:30 the next morning, Sophia stood outside Sterling Enterprises' gleaming headquarters, clutching her phone with Eleanor Sterling's number displayed on the screen. The building stretched toward the sky like a monument to ambition, all glass and steel and intimidating corporate power. She pressed call before she could lose her nerve. Eleanor Sterling speaking. Madame Sterling, it's Sophia Mendez. I've made my decision. And Sophia took a deep breath, watching early commuters stream past her on the sidewalk. Normal people going to normal jobs, not contemplating fake marriages to save community centers. I'll do it. I'll marry your grandson. Eleanor's satisfaction was audible even through the phone. Excellent. Can you be at the board meeting in 30 minutes? Alexander will need his fiancée there when he makes the announcement. I'm already here, Sophia said, looking up at the building's imposing facade. But I have conditions. I'm listening. The marriage contract includes provisions for the community center funding, regardless of how the year goes. This arrangement fails. If your grandson decides he can't stand being married to me, the money doesn't disappear. Agreed. What else? Complete honesty between Alexander and me about expectations. No games, no surprises. If we're going to make this look real, we need to at least be able to trust each other with the truth. Eleanor chuckled. Dear, you're going to be very good for him. Yes, I agree to your terms. Now, come up to the 42nd floor. It's time to meet your future husband's business associates. As Sophia ended the call and walked toward the building's entrance, she caught her reflection in the glass doors. She looked terrified but determined, like someone about to jump out of an airplane while hoping the parachute would work. In exactly 1 hour, she would be engaged to Alexander Sterling. In exactly 1 month, she would be his wife. The thought should have sent her running in the opposite direction. Instead, she squared her shoulders and walked through the doors into whatever came next. 6 months later, Sophia stood in Alexander's penthouse kitchen, watching him burn toast while trying to simultaneously answer emails and conference calls. It was 7 a.m., and he'd already been up for 2 hours, his hair still damp from the shower, wearing nothing but jeans and a wrinkled dress shirt. He hadn't bothered to button properly. The Jakarta deal can wait, he was saying into his Bluetooth earpiece while waving a butter knife at his laptop screen. I'm not signing anything until we resolve the environmental impact concerns. Sophia quietly took over the toast duty, sliding 2 perfectly golden pieces onto a plate. This had become their morning routine, somewhere around month 3. When she'd realized that Alexander's idea of breakfast was black coffee and whatever he could grab from the fridge without looking. Environmental concerns? She'd asked him one morning, "Since when do you care about that?" "Since I married someone who made me realize that profit margins aren't the only thing that matters," he'd replied, looking almost surprised by his own words. That conversation had been a turning point. Not the first one, but perhaps the most important. The first turning point had come 3 weeks into their arrangement. When Alexander found Sophia crying over her laptop at 2 in the morning, she'd been trying to write thank you letters to the community center's donors. But the words felt hollow when she knew the truth about how the funding had really been secured. "I've built my entire career on honesty," she'd sobbed. "And now I'm living the biggest lie of my life." Alexander had sat beside her on the couch, awkward in his expensive pajamas, clearly uncomfortable with emotional displays. "It's not entirely a lie," he'd said quietly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we're actually married. Feelings might be fake, but the commitment to make this work isn't. At least it doesn't have to be." That night, they'd established new rules. No more pretending when they were alone. No more perfect couple act behind closed doors. Just two people trying to navigate an impossible situation with as much dignity as they could manage. The second turning point had come during their first public appearance together, a charity gala for children's literacy. Sophia had been terrified, convinced that everyone would see through their charade immediately. But Alexander had surprised her. Tell me about your work," he'd said as they waited in the car outside the venue. "Really tell me. Not the elevator pitch version." So she had. She'd told him about Marcus, who'd started writing poetry after joining the creative writing program. About Sandra, whose math scores had improved dramatically once she had a quiet place to study. About Thomas, who was now applying to colleges he never thought he could afford. When they'd entered the gala, Alexander hadn't just played the part of a supportive husband. He'd genuinely listened as she spoke to other attendees about the community center's programs. He'd asked intelligent questions and made connections she never would have thought to pursue. "You're good at this," she'd told him later that night. "I'm good at a lot of things when I'm not trying to prove how superior I am to everyone else," he'd replied. The third turning point had been more gradual. Somewhere between sharing morning coffee and late-night conversations about everything except their fake marriage. They'd started to become friends. Real friends, who argued about movies and shared takeout containers and fell asleep on opposite ends of the couch while watching documentaries. Alexander, she'd discovered, was nothing like the arrogant playboy the tabloids portrayed. He was driven, yes, and sometimes ruthlessly focused on his goals. But he was also surprisingly thoughtful, remembering her preference for oat milk in her coffee and always asking about the kids at the community center by name. The fourth turning point had come last month, when Eleanor Sterling had invited them to Sunday dinner and dropped a bombshell. "I have a confession to make," she'd said over dessert, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "I may have slightly orchestrated your first meeting." Alexander had nearly choked on his wine. "What do you mean orchestrated?" "I mean, I had James drive the same route every morning for 2 weeks, watching you speed through that neighborhood like you owned it. And I may have mentioned to Mrs. Henderson at the community center that someone should really complain about the reckless drivers on Oakwood Avenue." Sophia had stared at the elderly woman in amazement. "You knew I'd be walking down that street." "I knew someone from the community center walked that route every morning. I was hoping it would be you, based on what my investigator had told me about your character. But I'll admit, the rock throwing was an unexpected bonus." "You manipulated both of us," Alexander had accused, but his tone held more admiration than anger. "I gave you both an opportunity," Eleanor had corrected smoothly. "What you've done with it has been entirely up to you." Now, standing in the kitchen 6 months later, Sophia realized Eleanor had been right. What had started as a business arrangement had become something else entirely, something real and complicated and terrifying in the best possible way. Alexander's voice broke through her thoughts. He'd finished his call and was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "We need to talk." Her heart stuttered. This was it. The end of their year was approaching, and he was going to ask for his freedom back. She'd known this moment would come, but she wasn't prepared for how much it would hurt. "Of course," she said, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "What about?" Alexander ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd learned meant he was nervous. "The divorce papers came yesterday. It's from my lawyer. They're sitting on my desk, ready to be signed." Sophia nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "The thing is," Alexander continued, moving closer to her, "I don't want to sign them, you don't?" "No, I don't want this to end, Sophia. Not the marriage, not living together, not whatever this has become between us." He gestured helplessly. I know it wasn't supposed to be real, but somewhere along the way, it became the most real thing in my life. Sophia felt tears prick her eyes. Alexander, I love you, he said quietly. I know I'm probably the last person you ever expected to hear that from, considering how we met. But I love your passion for helping others. I love how you call me out when I'm being an ass. It's like the love how you make me want to be better than I thought I could be. I love you too, Sophia whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. I've been trying not to, because this was supposed to be temporary. But Alexander's lips were on hers before she could finish the sentence, soft and warm and tasting like coffee and possibilities. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. So what do we do now? He asked. Sophia smiled, her heart feeling lighter than it had in months. We tear up those divorce papers. And then we have a real wedding, with our real friends and family, because I want to marry you for all the right reasons this time. And the community center gets its funding regardless, just like we agreed. But now it gets something even better. It gets a co-director who actually knows how to balance budgets and has connections with half the philanthropists in the city. Alexander laughed, the sound rich and genuinely happy. Are you offering me a job, Mrs. Sterling? I'm offering you a partnership, Mr. Sterling, in every sense of the word. 6 months later, they stood in the community center's renovated gymnasium, surrounded by the people who mattered most to them. Thomas, now a freshman at MIT, served as Alexander's best man. Marcus, whose poetry had been published in the local newspaper, walked Sophia down the aisle. Eleanor Sterling sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief and looking supremely satisfied with her matchmaking skills. As they exchanged vows they'd written themselves, Sophia thought, about the rock that had started it all. Such a small thing, thrown in a moment of frustration, but it had changed everything. I promise to love you not in spite of your flaws, but including them, Alexander said, his voice strong and clear. I promise to support your dreams, even when they involve me getting my hands dirty in ways I never imagined. And I promise never to drive through puddles when you're walking nearby. The audience laughed, and Sophia felt her heart swell with happiness. I promise to love you not because you're perfect, but because you're perfectly imperfect, she replied. I promise to challenge you when you need it and support you when you don't. And I promise never to throw rocks at expensive cars, even when their owners deserve it. When they kissed this time, it was as husband and wife for the second time. But as partners in love for the first, the community center erupted in cheers, and somewhere in the back of the room, a photographer captured the moment when two people who'd started as enemies discovered they were meant to be everything to each other. Later that night, as they danced to music played by the community center's youth orchestra, Alexander whispered in Sophia's ear, "Thank you for throwing that rock." "Thank you for being worth throwing it at," she whispered back. Eleanor Sterling watched from her table, a glass of champagne in her hand and triumph in her eyes. Sometimes she reflected, the best matches were the ones that seemed impossible from the start. Sometimes people needed to crash into each other before they could figure out how to fit together. And sometimes a perfectly thrown rock was exactly what two stubborn people needed to find their way to love. The end.